So I just would like to invite Abbot Mark Patrick Hederman up to actually officially launch the book.
Thank you very much. What a daunting crowd we have here today. In his introduction to this magnificent book, Best Loved Poems from the West of Ireland, Tom Walsh describes the old province of Connaught as full of wild and lonely places. Now, all the poets that are quoted in this book, they come from after the beginning of the 19th century, except for Oliver Goldsmith and Misha Rafferty, whose birth date is uncertain. And therefore, the whole of this book, everything about it, could only have happened in the last 200 years, because it is a completely new and modern view of the world that we inhabit. Before the 19th century, all relatively wild and remote areas were not seen as beautiful, but as uncivilized and dangerous. If you read even Daniel Defoe, for instance, from 1725, he will describe places which now in England are premier tourist sites as, and I quote, the most desolate, wild and abandoned country in all of England. So before the 19th century, Scotland was regarded as a barbarous jungle, visited only by adventurers and sports people, hunting and shooting, for instance, until Queen Victoria, on a summer visit, looked out the window of her carriage and was delighted by what she saw. So this was called the Queen's View, and it turned that particular spot into one of the major tourist venues in the world. And that was only because ordinary people began to have leisure and began to have enough money to travel and to transform themselves from troglodytes into tourists. Then transport improved and hotels were built to accommodate the crowds of visitors. And now people fly from the other end of the planet to relish the scenery and avail of all the luxuries which are beautifully photographed in this volume. And it was poetry that changed our view. It was really Wordsworth and the Romantic poets who created a whole climate of mysticism around natural beauty and the aura of the countryside, which most of us now take for granted today. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild. These pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, the deep and gloomy wood, their colours and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, and of all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. That was Wordsworth's transformation of nature and the countryside into what we now take for granted and which we have pictured, because that's the other invention that makes this beautiful book possible, the camera and the photograph, which also started about the middle of the 19th century. It took artists of the Middle Ages 300 years to invent and to develop the trick of perspective, which allowed them to paint pictures capturing the reality we saw in front of us. So if you look at a painting by Caravaggio, for instance, it makes you think that you are really present at the scene that he is portraying. And yet, it's only a trick. His canvas is a tiny, limited, flat surface pretending to be a window onto a world. So the inventors of photography managed to produce a machine which could do all that and do it much more realistically. So from the first decades of the 20th century, photography seemed to capture much more detail and give much more information than painting or sculpture ever could. And the result was twofold. The result was that art felt itself ousted and began to explore other avenues such as cubism, impressionism, and abstract art. And photography was devalued and was never accorded any of the prestige in which great paintings were held. And this was wrong, because great artists can yield a camera just as creatively as they can hold a brush. And certainly in this book you have proof that photography can be and is an art form. The exceptional composition can only be Liam Lyons. Beauty is always in the eye of the beholder, and the human interest which he brings to each one of these is enough to warm the heart as well as to dazzle the eye. And the cover of the book, if you look at it, it took me 3 weeks to discover that there are 4 horses on the cover and not just 3. Because he couldn't get one of them to move when he was creeping up on them and taking this photograph. So there's also always in the photographs that wonderful human interest that he brings to the composition. And the book would want anybody to see the places that it depicts. I will arise and go now, for I hear it in the deep heart's core. It was by the early 1930s that increasing public interest in the countryside, and that was because of the growing and mobile urban populations, turned tourism into one of our major industries. And let us take this book as an example of how to cooperate and how to produce optimum results. Here we have a win-win situation where everybody is working together to use our natural resources, the beauty of our countryside, the benefits of our culture, to produce a maximum profit, which we then use to help people who are less well off than ourselves. All the proceeds for this magnificent volume go towards the Westport-Aror partnership, which for the last 27 years has spent over 500,000 on humanitarian programs in the Kenyan district of Aror. So when you buy 10 copies of this beautiful book here today, you are also supporting a very worthy cause. So this is the year of the gathering. And the gathering has brought so many people to visit us here in Ireland. It would be an excellent idea for Fáilte Ireland Taoiseach to adopt this book and to send it to every country in the world so that many more will be attracted to the extraordinary beauty and atmosphere which are present here on this tiny island in such abundance, and which have been captured exquisitely, almost like dried flowers in the pages of this book. My pages blank for the whims of the day. Here I will inscribe readings, and return then my face aglow with a booty of old words and new echoes. Thank you.